Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. I was tagged by Sean the Book Maniac to do the book nostalgia tag, which was originally created by Noah of Everyone Who Reads It Must Converse. And I'll have the link to that below as well as Sean's channel. So there's a few prompts in this and I'll try to go quickly, but part of it is to see, like, sort of wallow with this nostalgia, right? So I'll try to be quick, but also, you know, give the necessary information as well, because it seems like a tag that's mostly about having people that follow you get to know you a little bit. So the first tag is the oldest book from your life that you still own, which, for context, when I was growing up, my parents were very young and they were in school and they sort of took work wherever they could as art teachers. And so we bounced around quite a bit before settling, which means we didn't really have many possessions until we did settle down, which wasn't until grade 7, so junior high school here. And so I was born in London, Ontario, then we went to Nova Scotia, then back to London, then Black Lake, Saskatchewan, a reserve that's pretty far north. Then Ontario, we went to Ottawa, and then finally Calgary is when we went for junior high school. And so my oldest book is a school book that we were made to read and I guess purchase, and that is A Separate Peace, which is a coming-of-age story by Knowles, and it's an okay book. If people wanted a coming-of-age story that was recommended in school, even though it wasn't recommended here for us at my time anyway, I would probably recommend A Tree in Brooklyn over this book, just because this is interesting, but sort of has a sloppy execution of themes, and it feels just sort of like way too heteronormative. Boys looks back on his life and kind of recontextualizes the wrong things, is what it seems like to me. And A Tree in Brooklyn has way more cogent and interesting themes that and I recently read this because I found it in a box in the basement, as well as A Tree in Brooklyn, and so I read them back to back, and I can definitively say A Tree in Brooklyn is better. But this does bring back feelings of junior high, which for me is mostly just starting another school and trying to fit in, and I was pretty standoffish and didn't really care about making friends because I had sort of like solidified my transient identity in that I didn't get close to people because I was just going to leave anyway, and it was something that I didn't really ever shake off, really, because even after high school I took a job where I was transient and traveling for work too, so it's something that was ingrained in me forever, basically. The first library book that I loved that I can remember is the first Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. And this is kind of special for me because I don't typically gravitate towards comedy, humor, satire of any sort. I generally don't like it, don't think it's well handled or executed or resonates with me whatsoever. Hence Catch-22, I hated. I just found it was misogynist and shitty. But this, it feels very prescient. It feels witty and actually satirical and highly intelligent and just a good romp. I read it at the right time for it, I think, when I was like 16, 17 or something like that. And so it's the first book that I took out that I properly loved, but also it was one of the first times again for me where we could get a library card and I could expect to actually get stuff out because we weren't foreseeably moving anytime soon. So that's interesting. A book that is given to me, I'm counting it because my brother got me into this book by getting me to log into his Audible and downloading it and then consuming it that way, and so I consider it the same. He pushed me to read it in any case, and I got it for free from him, so same, I think. So this book is The Darkness That Comes Before. I managed to get a used copy. They're pretty hard to come by, which is weird because it is by R. Scott Bakker, who is a Canadian, and so you would think that it would be fairly ubiquitous here, because if something is published in Canada, a lot of times it doesn't leave Canada. But this is popular enough with fantasy nerds that I guess it just got eaten up. And as a side note, it's sad because I read that he got pretty screwed by his publisher on these books, at least the first trilogy of them. And the second trilogy, I think he switched it up to a different publisher, and it was a good move. But this is a dark fantasy book that interrogates toxic masculinity, misogyny explicitly, as well as the white savior trope that is heavily featured in fantasy. It is quite different than most books. It is serious in its undertaking as a dark fantasy book. R. Scott Bakker is a philosophical professor, or he's a professor of philosophy. And you can tell there's a lot of his thinking is embedded in this book. That said, there is some contention as to if he execute the themes very well across the two trilogies. I think he does. Obviously, it's my favorite fantasy trilogy and dual trilogy, I guess, ever. But people have some salient points as to how he may or may not measure up to their own standards of his very complex and interesting themes, but also problematic at times if not done well. So it's an interesting debate at the very least. And for me, his prose are just exactly perfect. They're precise, they're like just evocative enough not to be flowery. He has actual meaningful things to say that are quite different than other fantasy and dark fantasy stuff, which usually just seems to be edgelords. And I highly recommend it. The audiobooks are quite good for just the first trilogy, and then the second trilogy, the guy is terrible and mispronounces everybody's name, including the actual character's name, the protagonist. So the next one is a book recommended to me. I'm going to go with one that my father harped on me to read for as long as I can remember. And no, it is not Lord of the Rings. It is instead the Book of Earthsea by Le Guin, queen that she is of fantasy. And I love these books. I finally got them when this edition came out, illustrated by Charles Vess. I really like this because I read that Le Guin had actually collaborated with Vess such that the illustrations are very true as to what she was picturing or wanted, whereas a lot of other publishers did not do what she wanted. For instance, she explicitly wrote the character in this to be a person of color, and the other publishers didn't care and whitewashed them on the cover and didn't get the point of the stories, and so the covers were just really incongruent with what was happening in the actual text, and it made her quite angry. She was explicit about things across the internet. But these books are really great. I think they're very still even subversive of what you typically find in fantasy with tropes. There's an interesting magic system. It's about basically a chosen one, but I think done quite well. And there's a lot of different notions around philosophy and conflict specifically that Le Guin goes into with this book that I think is just perfect. And nostalgia-wise, my dad was on me to read these books forever, and of course as a teenager when your dad tells you to read something, or at least for me anyway, I did not want to, so I didn't until this edition came out. But I have fond memories of my father nagging me. I haven't done a buddy read yet, which it says a buddy read text for prompt 5, but I haven't done a buddy read yet, so maybe in the future, if you would like to do one, then just hit me up. So the next prompt is books introduced to you in school. Funnily enough, I actually came across a book, a box of books in my basement that was huddled in a little corner that I was trying to get to, and I hadn't opened it. Maybe my parents had given it to me or something like that, and I just shoved it off. But it ended up being a whole bunch of books from junior high and high school, and that's where I found a separate piece a couple months ago, as well as some of these. Tower of Evil. I don't know if this was introduced in school specifically, but I thought it would be fun to show regardless. I don't recall ever reading it. Neither do I recall this, A Swiftly Tilting Planet. This feels like probably just stuff that parents or friends bought me because they knew I was vaguely interested in fantasy or something. These ones for sure were from school though. So The Hobbit, of course, we read. J.R. Tolkien. I liked it, didn't go wild for it as some other people did. It didn't particularly get me to go into Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. I only recently read those, and I did like them, but again, I wasn't blown away or anything like that. But I did like them. And then the book that I most remember from school is A Streetcar Named Desire, which we read this book alongside watching the actual film as well, and then we studied it, and I loved it. It was one of the books in school that made a very deep impression, as well as Catcher in the Rye, and I started avidly following Brando's work for the short time that he was with us anyway, until a year or two later when my dad told me that he had learned that Brando and the director of A Night in Paris or something like that, something about Paris he was in, where they colluded to on-screen film the rape of the actress in that book. They colluded to actually rape the actress in a specific scene in that movie, and so I didn't watch any Brando again after that. The next tag is genre fiction that inspires nostalgia. For me, I chose The Vampire Lestat, even though what I actually want to talk about is the first book, The Interview with the Vampire. This is another dad thing. He was very excited for Interview with the Vampire when it came out, and it made a very big impression on me when I was watching it. I was probably too young for it or something like that, I'm not sure, but my dad is very outgoing about the things that he likes, so when you watch a movie with him at home and he's really into it, it's like you're in a theater with all of those people having a surge of emotions with you and reacting to the film as you are. And that was the first time that I recall that me noticing that was Interview with the Vampire, I think. I remember the opening line very vividly when he sits down with Christian Slater and they're bantering a little bit, and then he says, "Shall I begin like David Copperfield? I was born, I grew up." So I was very sucked into that movie in a way that was maybe the first time. My dad had shown us other stuff that he wanted us to of course, too, like Star Wars. He was avid for and still is. But as much as I like that, it still seems like fun that is kind of stupid, and it's pulpy basically. The next tag is literary fiction that inspires nostalgia. I chose For Love of the Game by Michael Shaara, who is known more for wartime books as far as I recall, but I've only ever read this. This was published posthumously by his son, and it is a book about a baseball star who has a very complicated relationship with his biological father, who teaches him how to pitch and doesn't really see him come to his rising star potential as a pitcher. And in the book, he has to make a decision between retiring or going after the love of his life. And so it also was made into a movie by with Kevin Costner. And I like the movie as well, but I like the book a lot more. It feels more complex and the prose are quite good. But the reason why this inspires nostalgia is I actually have never known my biological father, and so there's these weird dichotomy in my head where, especially when I was younger and more angry, I would sort of picture in a very like American baseball, Americana type of way, that I could have a relationship with my biological father that wasn't like my father, who I've known since I was like 2 or 3 or something like that, which is fairly antagonistic until we grew up. So because the son of Michael Shaara posthumously published this, and that relationship between father and sons is embedded in the text so much, and then my own feelings, it just is like a very vivid nostalgia thing. When I traveled for work for 10 years or so around Canada with my previous job, I would actually look for used copies of this in bookstores and grab it and then read it underneath like a tree or at the beach or wherever I was. So it was very like, it's a grounding book for me where I like sort of worked through, or tried to work through, some of the feelings about my father and that kind of stuff. Next tag is spiritual work. So I had read excerpts of this often, and I think I've read this before, probably like 10 or 15 years ago, but I only recently reread this year, and it is The Prophet by Kahlil Gibran. And I think this is like the best sort of like self-help, life awareness, wisdom, spiritual type mashup book that you could find. It's very evocative of religion, obviously, but I don't find his responses to be like that. It doesn't feel like a Christian text or any kind of specific text. It's more like just really salient, intelligent life advice that really resonated with me when I was in my early 20s, basically. And it is funny because I've heard Gibran's stuff quoted so often that it kind of has formed like this lattice work or web of different imagery that I can like pull on when I think of his work. First of all, it brings to mind an old show that I watched, One Tree Hill, where at the beginning of the show he would always quote a book. By no means is One Tree Hill, I think, like an amazing show, but that then makes me think of the episode that they did that was really good, which was on school shootings, which was like a big deal for us in Canada, at least, because we didn't really have school shootings. And so it was like I remember being like very affected by that episode, especially. And then also my grandmother would quote this sometimes, though I didn't know it. And so when I was reading it, I got the experience of reading a passage that I thought was quite deep, and then having like a memory hook, and then springboarding off of that into remembering my grandma say something. So it's just a nice feeling book. One of my all-time favorite texts for sure. Probably my top 10. I would bring it to a desert island type deal. So for the last bit, there is a tagging part. And the last tag that I did by Sean the Maniac, I forgot to tag people, so I shan't do that again. I'll tag Bob the Bookerer. I don't think he's done it. I searched his name specifically, and it didn't come up, so I don't know. But I think he also has a backlog of a bunch of tags, so who knows, maybe it'll pop up anyway. Scallydandling with the books, I'd like to tag as well, and then I think everybody else has done it, or Sean just tagged them in his video anyway. So yeah, that is it for me. Thank you for watching, and if you would like to do the tag, then of course you're welcome to, as far as I'm aware. And I will talk to you next video.